When I was sorting through my late husband's belongings, I found an envelope in his coat. Open only when the children start dividing my estate. That's exactly what happened yesterday. What I found inside made me. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 72 years old. I have lived in the same house in Asheville, North Carolina, for 43 years. The white colonial with the blue shutters and the maple tree in the front yard that Harold planted the spring after we moved in. We raised 3 children in that house: our son Daniel, our older daughter Carolyn, and our younger daughter Susan. We buried a dog there, celebrated 20 graduations, 3 weddings, and too many Christmases to count. Harold and I were married for 49 years. He died of a heart attack on a Thursday morning in October, quietly in his armchair, with a cup of coffee going cold on the side table beside him. I thought I knew what grief felt like. I had lost my parents, lost Harold's mother, lost a dear friend to cancer. But nothing prepares you for the specific silence that follows the death of the man who sat across from you at breakfast every morning for nearly half a century. The house did not feel empty. It felt like a word with its meaning removed. All the shape still there, none of the weight. Harold had been a careful man, an engineer by training, methodical by nature. He kept records of everything: utility bills going back to 1987, car maintenance logs, property tax receipts filed in manila folders organized by year. He had written a will. He had spoken to our attorney, James Pruitt, on more than one occasion. I knew the broad shape of his wishes. The house would remain mine for as long as I lived. The savings were to be divided equally among the 3 children after my passing, and certain personal items: his father's pocket watch, his woodworking tools, the old Ford truck in the garage, were designated specifically in the document. It was all clear. It was all settled, or so I believed. The first sign of trouble came not at the funeral, not in the weeks of casseroles and condolence cards that followed, but approximately 6 weeks after we buried Harold, on a Sunday afternoon when Daniel drove up from Charlotte unannounced. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched, and he said, in a voice that was careful in the wrong way, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed the words, that he had been thinking about the house. "Mom," he said, "you have to be practical. This place is too big for one person. The property taxes alone." I told him I was managing fine. He nodded as if I had said something naive. Carolyn called 2 days later. She did not mention the house directly. She mentioned instead that Harold's truck was just sitting there, and that her husband Brett had been needing a second vehicle, and would I mind if they came to pick it up that weekend. I said I would need to check the will first. There was a pause on the line. Brief but unmistakable. The pause of someone recalibrating. "Of course," she said warmly, too warmly. I did not yet understand what I was seeing. I told myself that grief made people awkward, that my children were simply trying to be practical, that these were reasonable conversations. I told myself this even as the calls became more frequent, even as Daniel began forwarding me real estate listings for senior communities near Charlotte, even as Carolyn stopped asking how I was doing and started asking, with increasing specificity, about Harold's investment accounts. Susan, the youngest, said nothing. She lived in Portland and called every Sunday, as she always had, and she did not mention the house or the truck or the accounts. I noticed her silence as surely as I noticed the others' noise. It was on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after the funeral, that I finally went through Harold's coats. I had been avoiding the hall closet. His wool overcoat still smelled faintly of him, that particular mixture of cedar and aftershave, and something I had no name for, only recognition. I pressed my face against the collar for a long moment. Then I checked the pockets, the way you do, methodically, before anything goes to donation. In the right inside pocket of his navy peacoat, I found a sealed envelope. On the front, in Harold's precise small handwriting, were the words, "Open only when the children start dividing my things." I stood in the hallway for a full minute without moving. The house was quiet around me. The maple tree outside made its small sounds against the window. I did not open it that day. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Harold had known. Somehow, in that quiet, methodical way of his, he had seen something coming that I had not, or had not let myself see. And he had left me a message for exactly this moment. That was the moment I understood that what was happening in my family was not grief making people awkward. It was something else entirely. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the bed Harold and I had shared for decades, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the envelope on the kitchen table, and I thought about Daniel's carefully rehearsed voice, and Carolyn's pause on the telephone, and Susan's careful, watchful silence. I thought about Harold's face, not as it had been in the armchair on that Thursday morning, but as it had been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, sitting at this same kitchen table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, going through papers. Harold had always known things before I did. He was not a man who alarmed easily, but when he was troubled, he went quiet in a particular way. I had seen that quietness in him in the last year of his life, and I had told myself it was fatigue, it was his health, it was the natural slowing of an old man. I had not asked him directly what was wrong. I wished, lying there in the dark, that I had asked. In the morning, I made coffee, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened the envelope. Inside were two things. The first was a letter, handwritten on 3 pages, front and back, in Harold's small, careful script. The second was a folded document, a copy of something legal, with the name of James Pruitt's office in the header. I read the letter first. Harold had written it 14 months before his death. He had written it, he explained, because he had noticed things. Daniel had borrowed money from us, $42,000 over 6 years, in amounts ranging from $3,000 to $15,000, always for reasons that sounded urgent, and always with promises of repayment that never materialized. Harold had kept a record. The letter included dates, amounts, and a handwritten ledger on the back of the 3rd page. Harold had not told me about most of these loans because, he wrote, he had not wanted to worry me, and because each time Daniel had seemed genuinely distressed, and Harold had been unable to say no to his own son. But he had kept the records. He had always kept the records. Carolyn, he wrote, was a different matter. Carolyn had never asked for money directly. What she had done over the years was position herself. She had offered at various points to help manage certain financial matters when Harold's health began declining. She had raised, more than once, the question of power of attorney. She had suggested, gently and repeatedly, that Harold should simplify his estate planning. Harold had not trusted these suggestions. He had not changed his will, and he had not given anyone power of attorney. But he had worried about what would happen after he was gone. The legal document was a codicil to the will, an amendment Harold had added 11 months before his death, which I had not known about, that specified in precise legal language that the house could not be sold without the written consent of both myself and Susan, and that any disputes regarding the estate were to be mediated through James Pruitt's office with Susan present. He had protected me. Even from a distance of time, from beyond his own death, Harold had reached out and tried to protect me. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, the maple tree stood bare and patient against the November sky. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I am 72 years old, and I had spent nearly 50 years in a partnership with a man who managed the harder edges of things. And now I was alone, and my two older children were circling something that I was only beginning to understand the shape of. Fear is not something I am ashamed of. Fear is honest. But I am also the daughter of a woman who raised 4 children through her husband's illness and death, with nothing but a 10th grade education and sheer stubbornness. I am the granddaughter of people who left everything they knew and built a life in a new country with their hands. Fear has never been the end of anything in my family. It has only ever been the beginning. I picked up the phone and called James Pruitt. He remembered Harold warmly. He confirmed the codicil. He confirmed that it was legally binding and had been properly filed. And then I told him what I had been observing. The pressure from Daniel, the questions from Carolyn about the accounts, the real estate listings. And he listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, in the careful way of a man who has practiced law for 35 years, "Margaret, I think it would be wise for you to come in." I made the appointment for Thursday. Then I called Susan. She answered on the second ring, her Portland morning still early, and when I told her I had found a letter from her father, she went very quiet. Not Carolyn's calculated pause, but the real silence of someone absorbing something important. Then she said, "Mom, I'll come home." I told her not yet. I told her I needed a few more days to understand what I was dealing with. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet house, and I thought, Harold left me a map. Now I need to learn how to read it. The plan was beginning to form. James Pruitt's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Lexington Avenue. The kind of office that smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish and the specific gravity of accumulated legal experience. I had been there twice before. Once when we first wrote our wills, and once to update beneficiary designations after Carolyn's second marriage. Both times Harold had done most of the talking. This time I was alone, and I noticed walking through the door that I felt differently about the room than I had before. It was no longer a place where things were arranged for me. It was a place where I intended to arrange things for myself. James was in his mid-60s, a quiet man with reading glasses that he frequently misplaced. He had known Harold for 20 years. He shook my hand, offered coffee, and sat down across from me with the file he had already pulled. We went through everything methodically. The codicil was valid. Harold had executed it properly, with witnesses, and it had been filed with the county. The house was jointly titled in both our names, and the codicil specified the conditions under which it could be transferred. Daniel's loans were documented in Harold's letter, but not in any formal legal instrument, which meant that, as a straightforward debt, they would be very difficult to enforce. However, James noted, if Daniel were to make any claim against the estate based on prior contributions or caregiving, a tactic he had seen used before, Harold's records would be relevant. "Do you expect that?" I asked. James chose his words the way Harold might have chosen them. "I expect that if there is pressure being applied about the house or the accounts, someone has been doing research into what options are available to them." That sentence stayed with me. I asked James to prepare 2 documents, a formal letter confirming the terms of the estate, which I intended to share with all 3 children, and a written record of our meeting that I could keep in my own files. He said he would have both ready within the week. The formal letter arrived 4 days later by email. I printed 3 copies. What happened next confirmed everything Harold had suspected. I sent the letter to Daniel and Carolyn by certified mail. I wanted proof of receipt. And to Susan by email, with a call to explain. Daniel's response came in 48 hours. A phone call in which he was not shouting exactly, but was using the particular tightly controlled voice of a man suppressing something large. He said the letter was unnecessary and hurtful, that he was only trying to help, that he couldn't believe I had gone to an attorney without talking to him first. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, that I had simply wanted everyone to have accurate information. There was a pause. Then, "Mom, who have you been talking to? Not what are you planning, not what does the letter say, but who have you been talking to?" As if the problem was not the information itself, but its source. Carolyn did not call. She texted, "Received the letter. We should talk in person. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the content." But it was what Susan told me the following evening that became the point of no return. Susan had been going through some of Harold's files, physical ones, which she had visited Asheville to begin organizing with my permission. In the bottom drawer of Harold's desk, behind a folder of old tax returns, she found something I had not known existed. A series of printed email exchanges between Carolyn and Harold, spanning 3 years, in which Carolyn had, with increasing directness, been raising the possibility of Harold updating his estate plan to give her broader authority over family finances. In one exchange, dated 14 months before Harold's death, the same month he had written his letter to me, Harold had responded in 3 sentences. He had written that he appreciated her concern, that he had full confidence in his current arrangements, and that he would prefer she not raise the matter again. Carolyn had not replied to that email. Instead, 14 months later, she had begun calling me about the truck. I read those printed pages at my kitchen table while Susan sat across from me, watching my face. I read them twice. Outside, the Asheville evening was dark and cold, and the maple tree was still. "She planned this," I said. Susan said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I had walked into James Pruitt's office with suspicions and Harold's word. I walked out of my own kitchen that night with documented evidence. The shape of what was happening had resolved, finally, from fog into something hard and clear and undeniable. There was no going back now for any of us. The plan, as I had worked it out in the days between finding the emails and acting on them, was not complicated. Complicated plans require things to go right. Simple ones only require you to be steady. The first part was legal. James Pruitt filed a formal notice of estate terms with the county probate office, creating a public record that would make any attempt to challenge the will's provisions, through claims of incapacity, undue influence, or disputed ownership, significantly more difficult and expensive. This was Harold's codicil, doing its work, but filed officially with a paper trail. James also drafted, at my request, a letter to both Daniel and Carolyn, formally itemizing the outstanding loans Harold had documented. Not a demand for repayment, not yet, but a notification of record. The loans existed, they were documented, and the estate was aware of them. The second part was financial. I met with a financial advisor, not the man Daniel had once suggested I use, whose name I now noticed Harold had never endorsed, but a woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been recommended by my friend Ruth. Patricia was methodical and plain-speaking. Together we reviewed the investment accounts, confirmed the beneficiary designations Harold had arranged, and moved the primary checking account to a different institution. This was not secrecy. I told both Susan and James what I had done, but it put distance between my financial life and the people I no longer trusted to have good intentions toward it. The third part was informational. I wrote a clear, factual letter to all 3 children, again through James's office, again by certified mail, describing the status of the estate, confirming Susan's involvement as Harold had specified in the codicil, and noting that going forward, any questions regarding the estate should be directed to James Pruitt. Daniel received his copy on a Wednesday. By Friday evening, he was at my door. He had not called ahead. He stood on my porch in a coat I didn't recognize, his jaw set in a way I remembered from when he was 17 and had been caught in a lie, and he was not alone. His wife Karen was with him, which I had not expected, and which I understood immediately as a tactical decision. Karen had always been the softer face of their partnership. She hugged me at the door. Daniel said he just wanted to talk. We sat in the living room. Karen kept her expression warm and concerned. Daniel spoke about family, about how Harold would have wanted us to work things out together, about how he was worried about me being isolated with people who didn't have the family's best interests at heart. He meant Susan. He meant James. Then he said quietly that he had spoken to another attorney, one who believed there might be grounds to question certain decisions Harold had made toward the end, given his health. There it was. Not a suggestion, not a conversation. A threat. The room was very still. I looked at my son. This man I had raised, who had learned to walk in this same house, who had sat at this kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner 30 feet away. And I felt something that was not anger and not sadness, but a cold, clarifying kind of grief. The grief of seeing something clearly that you had been hoping to see differently. I said, Daniel, what Harold decided at any point in his life was decided with full legal capacity, properly witnessed, and on file with an officer of the court. If your attorney believes there are grounds to challenge that, then your attorney will be speaking to James Pruitt. Karen reached over and touched Daniel's arm. He did not move. Mom, I think you should go, I said. He stood. His face was doing something complicated. For a moment, I thought he might say something that would break through, some old, honest version of himself. But he didn't. He nodded once, and he and Karen left. I locked the door. I stood in the hallway, and I breathed. Then I called James and told him what had been said. He was not surprised. He told me the estate was protected, that the codicil was solid, and that if Daniel's attorney made any formal move, we would be ready. After I hung up, I turned off the living room lights, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I did not sleep immediately, but I lay in the quiet, and I let myself simply rest. Not from the conflict, which was not over, but from the performance of managing it. For 3 days, I did not read emails. I walked. I cooked. I sat on the back porch in my old cardigan with coffee and watched the winter yard and let my mind go soft. Harold had always said that the hardest work sometimes looks like doing nothing. I needed those 3 days. What was coming next would require every bit of steadiness I had. The offer came from Carolyn. That surprised me slightly. I had expected Daniel to be the one to reach first, since he was the one who had escalated to threats. But perhaps that was the strategy. Let the threat sit and soften, and then send the more presentable sibling with something that looked like a solution. She called on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after Daniel's visit, while I was in the kitchen making oatmeal. Her voice was warm, carefully, precisely warm. The way a room looks when someone has cleaned it specifically because they are expecting company. She said she had been thinking. She said she knew things had gotten tense and that wasn't what anyone wanted. She said she and Brett had talked and they had a proposal they thought might actually solve everything. What if, she said, they bought out my equity in the house at full market value, she was careful to emphasize. And I moved into a smaller, newer place that would be much easier for me to manage. They would handle all the logistics. I wouldn't have to worry about property taxes or maintenance, and the money from the sale would be available for me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. She said all of this smoothly. She had rehearsed it. I stood at the stove and I listened to every word and I thought, this is the version of the plan they believe I might accept. Not force. I had shown them that force would not work. This was persuasion. This was the house dressed up as a gift. When she finished, I said, Carolyn, the house is not for sale. A pause. Mom, I just think if you considered, the house is not for sale, I said again. Not to you, not to anyone. Not while I am living. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm only trying to help you, she said, and her voice had acquired something underneath the warmth. Something thin and tight, the way a wire sounds when it's pulled. I know, I said. Thank you for calling. I ended the call. I finished my oatmeal. I did not shake, which surprised me because I had half expected to. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as the sensation of a door closing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, final click of something that has been correctly latched. After that, they went quiet for a while. Susan and I talked every other day, and she reported she had become, by this point, my careful set of eyes in the digital world, monitoring certain things I was not equipped to monitor, that there had been no contact from any attorney, no formal filings, no legal activity. Daniel and Carolyn were watching, waiting to see if I would tire or weaken, or simply give in to the attrition of being old and alone. They did not know me as well as they believed. What they did not account for was Ruth. My friend Ruth Alderman had been my closest friend for 31 years. We had met in a neighborhood book club in 1994 and had survived the death of the book club, 2 house moves apiece, 1 cancer scare, hers, 1 knee replacement, mine, and the general erosion that time performs on lesser friendships. Ruth was not a woman who offered sentiment when practicality was more useful. When I told her, over lunch at the little Italian place on Merriman Avenue, where we had been meeting for years, the full shape of what was happening, the loans, the emails, Daniel's threat, Carolyn's offer, she listened without interrupting. And then, when I finished, she said, "Have you talked to Pastor Williams?" I had not. I had not been leaning on the church in the way I perhaps should have, partly from habit and partly from a private reluctance to appear in need. But Ruth was right. I went the following Sunday, and I spoke briefly to Pastor Williams after service. And he was, as he had always been, the kind of man who understood that sometimes what a person needs is not advice, but witness. Someone to know the truth of a situation and to say simply, I see this, and it is real, and you are not imagining it. He also connected me, practically, with a woman in the congregation, a retired social worker named Diane, who had experience helping elderly parishioners navigate exactly these kinds of family dynamics. Diane and I met twice at the church office. She helped me understand what resources existed, what my rights were as a homeowner and surviving spouse, and, perhaps most valuably, she helped me see that what was being done to me had a name. It was called financial elder abuse. It was common, and it was, in the right circumstances, actionable. I was not alone. That was what those weeks showed me. I had Harold's foresight, James's legal knowledge, Susan's loyalty, Ruth's steadiness, and Diane's experience. And I had my own stubbornness, which had always been underestimated by everyone who knew me. That, I was beginning to think, might be the thing that mattered most. They came on a Saturday in January, together, which I should have taken as the first sign that this was not an ordinary visit. In our family, Daniel and Carolyn had not driven to Asheville together for anything short of a funeral, since their father's 60th birthday party. The fact that they arrived in the same car, parked at the curb at 11 in the morning without calling ahead, told me immediately that this had been coordinated. I had been warned, actually. Susan had called the night before. She had seen a text thread on a family group chat that I had been removed from at some point I hadn't noticed. And she told me that Daniel and Carolyn were planning to come, and that the language they were using to each other was the language of a campaign. We need to make her understand. She's not thinking clearly. She needs to hear this from both of us. So when the doorbell rang, I was already in the armchair with my coffee, and I had already decided how this would go. They came in with smiles. Carolyn had brought a coffee cake. Daniel hugged me and commented on how good the house looked. They sat on the sofa together, which they had never done before, always claiming opposite ends. And Carolyn cut the cake on the coffee table and served it like a hostess in someone else's home. And I noticed every single detail of the performance because I had spent 7 decades reading rooms. I offered them coffee, which I poured slowly and deliberately because I was in no hurry and I wanted them to feel that. I set the cups down on the table and I sat back in Harold's old armchair, the one they had once suggested I donate, the one I had no intention of donating. And I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. They began, as I expected, with love. How much they cared about me. How hard this had been for everyone. How grief does things to families, and how they didn't want our family to be one of the ones that fell apart. Daniel said he had been too aggressive in his earlier visit, and he apologized. And the apology was convincing enough that I felt, for a moment, the old pull of it, the desire, which never entirely disappears, to believe that your child is the person you want them to be. I let the apology sit there. I did not rush to accept it. I did not rush to reject it. I simply nodded, the way you nod when you are listening, which is different from the way you nod when you agree. Daniel shifted slightly. He had expected the apology to do more work than I was allowing it to do. Then Carolyn, smoothly, moved to the point. She said there was a practical matter they needed to address together. She said she had spoken to a few people. She did not say attorneys, she said people, who believed that Harold's estate arrangements, while well-intentioned, had created an imbalanced situation. She said that Susan's involvement in the estate decisions was unfair, given that Susan had lived in Portland for 20 years and had not been present for Harold's care in his final years. The implication being that Carolyn, who lived 2 hours away and had visited perhaps 6 times in the last 3 years of Harold's life, had earned some preferential standing. She slid a piece of paper across the coffee table. It was a typed document, informal, no letterhead, that outlined a proposed revised arrangement in which a family trustee would be appointed to oversee my finances and estate decisions. The proposed trustee was Carolyn. I looked at the paper. I looked at Carolyn. I looked at Daniel. "Who prepared this?" I asked. "We did," Daniel said, "together, because we care." "Did an attorney review it?" A slight hesitation. "We wanted to discuss it with you first," which meant no. I set the paper on the table without picking it up. "I don't need a trustee," I said. "I have an attorney. I have a financial advisor. I have Susan. I am 72 years old. I have full legal capacity, and I have made my decisions." Carolyn's warmth shifted, not entirely, but perceptibly. She said that I was isolating myself with people who didn't understand the family. She said Susan had always had her own agenda. She said that if something happened to me, she left the sentence unfinished in a way that was meant to feel like concern and felt instead like a door left ajar onto something darker. Daniel leaned forward. His voice dropped in the way that people's voices drop when they want to sound reasonable and instead sound pressurizing. He said that he only wanted what was best for me. He said that Brett, Carolyn's husband, had connections in real estate and could ensure I received full market value and more for the house if I chose to sell. He said the neighborhood was changing and that property values would not stay where they were forever. He said all of this as though it were information and not instruction, as though he were offering me a gift and not extracting something from me. I recognized the technique. It was the same technique he had been using since he was 14 years old and wanted the car keys. "Are you threatening me, Carolyn?" I asked, bringing the conversation back where I needed it. "Mom, of course not. We love—" "Because I want to be clear," I said, and I heard in my own voice something I recognized from Harold's best moments, that particular quietness that is not softness, that any formal attempt to have me declared incompetent or to contest this estate will be met with James Pruitt and with documentation that I have been assembling since November, including Harold's records, including printed emails. The room went very still. Carolyn's face did something I had not seen before. Not anger, but a blankness. The expression of someone whose script has run out. Daniel stood. His jaw was doing that thing again. He said, in a voice stripped of all warmth, "You're making a mistake." Karen had not come this time. There was no soft face to manage the temperature of the room, no hand on Daniel's arm. It was just the three of us, and the coffee cake that no one had finished, and the afternoon light coming through the windows of the house my husband had chosen and I intended to keep. "You should go," I said. They went. I closed the door behind them, and I stood in the hallway, and I let myself feel it. The fear that had been underneath all the steadiness, real and cold and honest. They were not finished. I knew they were not finished. Daniel's attorney comment had not been a bluff. Carolyn did not accept defeat in the way that normal people do. She accepted it the way water accepts a dam. She went around it, or she waited, or she found the crack. I had known her for 44 years. I knew how she moved when she was angry and pretending not to be. But the fear, when I felt it all the way through, did something I had not expected. It did not weaken me. It clarified me. Fear, I was learning, was information. And the information it was giving me was this: they will not stop until they are stopped. I went to the kitchen table and I wrote 3 things in my notebook: the date, the time, the names. Then I picked up the phone and called James Pruitt. It was time to finish this. The meeting was held at James Pruitt's office on a Wednesday morning in February. James had suggested it. He had, without my fully realizing it, been building toward this, reviewing Harold's documentation, verifying the codicil, consulting a colleague who specialized in elder law, and finally sending a formal letter to the attorney Daniel had referenced, whose name turned out to be a man named Gary Messner from a small firm in Charlotte. The letter invited all parties to a meeting to discuss the estate and clarify the legal standing of all claims before any formal proceedings were initiated. Daniel and Carolyn agreed to come because I believed they still thought they had leverage. Gary Messner agreed to come because his client was paying him to. Susan flew in from Portland the evening before. She stayed in her old room, and we sat up past midnight at the kitchen table, the same table where I had opened Harold's envelope. And Susan laid out everything she had assembled in the past 3 months: the printed emails, Harold's loan ledger, a timeline she had constructed from phone records and correspondence, and 2 additional documents that James had located during his research. The first was a record of Carolyn having contacted Harold's primary care physician 14 months before his death, without Harold's knowledge or consent, to inquire about his mental status. The doctor had not responded to the inquiry, but the contact had been noted in the file, which James had obtained through proper channels. The second was a bank record showing that Daniel had written himself a check from a joint account he briefly shared access to with Harold, an account Harold had set up for a home repair emergency fund in the amount of $9,000 18 months ago. It was not in Harold's loan ledger. It appeared to have been taken without discussion. I looked at those two pieces of paper for a long moment. Susan watched my face. "Is he going to go to jail?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, "but he is going to have to answer for it." I did not sleep well that night either. But it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the kind I had known in November. In November, I had lain awake in the grip of dread. That February night, I lay awake in the grip of something more focused, the particular alertness of a person who has done the preparation and is waiting simply for morning. I thought about Harold. I thought about the 3 pages of his letter, the careful handwriting, the ledger on the back of the 3rd page. I thought about the fact that he had kept those records for 6 years without telling me, carrying that knowledge the way a careful person carries a heavy thing, quietly, without complaint, because putting it down would not make it weigh less and would only leave it where someone else might trip on it. He had carried it, and then he had passed it to me. I was going to carry it the rest of the way. The next morning, I dressed carefully. The dark blue suit I had last worn to Harold's funeral. His photograph in my wallet. I brought it for no strategic reason, only because I needed him nearby. I drove to Lexington Avenue with Susan, and we walked into James's office at 9:45. Daniel and Carolyn arrived together at 10. Gary Messner was with them, a compact man in his 50s with a too confident expression that shifted almost imperceptibly when he saw how organized James's side of the table was. 4 neat document packets, 1 at each seat, a legal pad, 2 pens, the specific, unhurried orderliness of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. James opened the meeting by distributing the packets, the codicil, the probate filing, Harold's loan ledger, the estate attorney's formal assessment of the estate's legal standing. He did not editorialize. He simply placed the papers in front of people and let them read. Gary Messner read for 3 minutes. Then he looked at Daniel. Daniel said, and I watched this happen from across the table, that Harold's loan ledger was just his father's interpretation of informal family help. He said the loans were gifts, that they had never been framed as repayment arrangements, that Harold had always been supportive of his financial needs. James said, mildly, "Are you characterizing the $42,000 as gifts at the time they were made?" "They were family, because if they were gifts," James continued in the same mild tone, "then Daniel, you would have no basis for any claim against the estate based on prior contribution. Is that what you're saying?" I watched Daniel understand the trap he had just walked into. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of a few seconds. He looked at Gary Messner. Gary Messner looked at his legal pad. Carolyn tried to redirect. She said the issue was my well-being and competence to manage the estate independently. She said she had concerns. She used the words gently and carefully, as though they were packaging for something. James placed the doctor's record in front of her, the inquiry she had made to Harold's physician. "Were you concerned about Harold's mental status 14 months before his death?" he asked. Carolyn said that was a private family matter. "It's a medical record," James said, "obtained legally." "I was worried about him. You contacted his physician without his knowledge or consent," James said. 14 months before his death. At the same time he was documenting loans to your brother and amending his will to add the codicil you've been seeking to challenge. He paused. "That's a pattern, Carolyn. And it's documented." And Gary Messner put down his pen. I saw him do it. He did not pick it up again for some time. Carolyn looked at the table. Then she looked at me. I do not know what she was looking for. Whatever it was, I don't think she found it. I was not angry. I was not triumphant. I was simply present. A woman sitting in a chair at a table with her husband's work in front of her and her daughter beside her, waiting for the room to finish arriving at the place it had always been heading. Daniel said, with something that had gone past anger into something raw. You want to blow up this family over a house? I said, for the first time since sitting down. Harold spent 49 years building this family. You are the ones who decided to treat his death as a transaction. The room was silent. We have two options, James said. We can proceed through formal channels, in which case all of this documentation enters the probate record and becomes public. Or we can settle this matter here, today, with a signed agreement that the estate terms stand as written, the outstanding loans are acknowledged, and no further legal action is initiated by either party. Gary Messner leaned over to speak quietly to Daniel. A long moment passed, then another. Daniel's hands were flat on the table. Carolyn had not looked up. I waited. I had learned, over the past 3 months, how to wait. Carolyn said very quietly, almost to herself. Dad knew. It was not a question. I did not answer it. But yes, he had known. That was exactly the point. Daniel said, fine. The agreement was signed before noon. James had drafted it the day before, because James is the kind of man who drafts documents before the meeting in which they will be signed, because a man who waits to see which way the wind blows before picking up his pen has not yet understood what preparation is for. The document was 7 pages. Its terms were as follows. Daniel formally acknowledged the outstanding loans detailed in Harold's ledger, $42,000 with an agreed repayment schedule of $800 per month over 5 years, structured as a lien against his property to ensure enforcement. The $9,000 check was addressed separately. He acknowledged the withdrawal, characterized it as an advance against a personal loan that had not been formalized, and agreed to include it in the repayment schedule. No criminal proceeding was initiated. James's elder law colleague had advised that the amount and circumstances, while serious, were more efficiently resolved through civil agreement than criminal complaint. I accepted this. I did not feel generous. I felt practical. Harold had not raised a son to go to prison. He had raised a son who had made bad choices, and those choices had consequences that would follow Daniel for 5 years every month when the bank debited his account. Carolyn signed an acknowledgement that she had no legal standing to seek guardianship, trusteeship, or financial oversight of my affairs. She signed a statement that she would make no further contact with my healthcare providers, financial institutions, or legal representatives without my written invitation. Gary Messner, to his credit, had advised her to sign. He was a practical man, and he had seen in that room what he was working with. I watched them sign. I want to describe that moment accurately because it is easy to describe it wrongly, to make it feel like a courtroom drama, a scene of visible vanquishing, a moment in which the wrongdoers are seen to be brought low in some satisfying and cinematic way. It was not that. It was a conference room on a gray February morning with bad overhead lighting and a coffee maker in the corner that no one had touched, and 2 people signing their names to a document that told the truth about what they had done and what they would not be allowed to do. It was quiet. It was administrative. It was, in its quietness and its administrative finality, the most complete thing I had witnessed in months. Daniel did not look at me when he signed. He pressed the pen to the paper with the particular force of a man who is angry about having no remaining options, and he signed, and he slid the document to his right without comment. Carolyn looked at me before she signed. just for a moment, a brief, complicated look that I could not entirely decode. There was something in it that might have been shame, and something else that might have been a kind of exhausted recognition. The look of a person who has finally stopped arguing with a mirror. Then she looked away, and she signed. Gary Messner gathered his copies, shook James's hand with the professional neutrality of a man who has learned not to have opinions about outcomes, and left. James organized the documents with his customary care, made a note in the file, and looked up at me over his reading glasses. "That's done," he said, simply, as if it were a modest thing, which in one sense it was, and in another sense was the farthest thing from modest that I could imagine. The codicil stood. The house was mine. The estate was settled, as Harold had intended. Susan squeezed my hand as the last page was signed. I held her hand for a moment, and I looked at the table, and I thought about Harold's peacoat hanging in the closet at home, the pocket where the envelope had been, the care he had taken to write 3 pages and tuck them somewhere he knew I would find them when the time came. He had not written those pages in hope. He had written them in knowledge, the quiet, unsparing knowledge of a man who loved his family and could see it clearly, which are not always the same thing, and in this case, had not been. When the children start dividing my things. He had known. He had always known, in that quiet way of his, what was coming. And he had loved me enough to leave me the tools to meet it. We drove home in Susan's rental car. The February sky was low and gray, and the maple tree in the front yard was still bare, which is how maple trees are in February, and which I had always found, and found again that afternoon, strangely reassuring. Bear is not dead. Bear is waiting. Daniel and Carolyn did not speak to me directly that day. They left the building separately. Not together, I noticed. The alliance had frayed the moment the papers were signed. Whatever they had agreed to between themselves had served its purpose, and then collapsed when the purpose collapsed. This is what alliances built on shared appetite rather than shared values do. They hold while the thing they want is still possible and fall apart the moment it isn't. When Susan and I got home, she made tea, and I sat in Harold's armchair, and I did not say anything for a long time. The house was warm. The rooms were the same rooms they had always been. The sage green kitchen I had painted in the autumn was visible through the doorway, and it was still exactly the color I had chosen, and it was still exactly right. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be accurate about that. The stories where justice is done and the wrongdoers are punished and the wronged party stands in the light of their vindication, those stories do not quite capture what it actually feels like to win a fight you should never have needed to fight against your own children. What I felt, sitting in that armchair with Susan across from me and the tea going warm in my hands, was something closer to exhaustion that had been allowed to finally arrive, and something else, quieter, harder to name, that I believe was the weight of things being, at last, in their correct arrangement. Harold had trusted me with his map. I had followed it all the way to the end. I made dinner. Susan stayed for a week. Spring came, as it always does in Asheville, in a rush of dogwood and warm rain, and the maple tree leafed out by mid-April into the full, extravagant green that Harold had never, in 43 years, failed to remark upon. "Look at that tree," he would say, every spring, as if it were a small miracle. I remarked upon it myself that April, out loud, to no one, to Harold, perhaps. It felt right. I had expected survival after everything, the careful maintenance of what I had, the grinding forward of someone who has weathered a storm. What I got instead was something that surprised me, something that felt genuinely like renewal. I had the house, not as a thing being contested anymore, but as a place that was mine in the settled, unassailable way of a thing that has been defended and kept. I painted the kitchen the soft sage green I had always wanted, and Ruth said it looked like a kitchen in a magazine, which pleased me more than I expected. Patricia reorganized my finances into something cleaner and more secure. Daniel's repayment arrived on the first of every month, with the reliability of a man who had no choice. I put every dollar into a savings account in Susan's name. It seemed right that money Harold had lent in good faith should end up with the child who had honored it. Susan visited 3 times that year. In June, she brought Lily, my granddaughter, 9 years old, who took an immediate interest in Harold's woodworking tools. We spent an afternoon with sandpaper and a block of cedar, and the smell of the wood was Harold's smell, and I came very close to crying. Diane connected me with a support group for surviving spouses, which I attended skeptically and which became, over that year, one of the more valuable things in my life. Daniel and Karen sold their house in Charlotte and moved into an apartment. Karen had not known about most of the loans to Harold, and that knowledge had done something to their marriage that monthly payments could not repair. Carolyn and Brett separated that autumn. She called me once in October, her voice stripped of all its careful management, simply tired. She said she was sorry. I said I heard her. The real forgiveness was not yet available to me, but I meant what I said. In November, I returned to James Pruitt's office for a routine review. Sitting across from him, I felt something I had not expected. The sensation of being a person who had managed something, not a person to whom things had happened, but a person who had decided what to do and done it. Harold would be pleased, James said. I thought about that on the drive home. The maple was bare again, patient, waiting for spring. He had not left me a rescue. He had left me a map and trusted me to follow it. Look at that tree, I thought, pulling into the driveway. What did I learn? That the people who love you will sometimes become the people who test you. That preparation is a form of love. That silence, Harold's, Susan's, can carry more truth than the loudest insistence. That fear does not disqualify you from being brave. If your spouse has left you something, listen. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. If you are told that protecting yourself is selfish, don't believe it. I kept the house. I kept my dignity. I kept Harold's memory intact. What would you have done with that envelope? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for being here. My 78-year-old husband secretly transferred money to his daughter from his first marriage for 20 years. I said nothing. I just called his first wife. She said, "What daughter? We never had children." When I found out where my husband was really sending money all these years. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 74 years old. I want to tell you a story that took me 20 years to fully understand, and only 3 months to act on once I finally did. Howard and I met at a church fundraiser in Tucson in the spring of 1998. He was 62, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate, and he had the kind of steady, quiet confidence that I'd stopped expecting to find at my age. I was 54, a widow of 7 years, with 2 grown children of my own, and a small house on Mesquite Lane that felt too large for one person. We were introduced by mutual friends, and within a year we were married. It was, for a long time, genuinely good. Howard had been married before. He told me about it early. A brief first marriage in his 30s, no children, an amicable divorce. The woman's name was Patricia, and she lived somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Howard spoke of her without bitterness and without particular warmth, the way a person might mention a neighborhood they used to live in. I had no reason to ask more questions. I was not a jealous woman. I believed him. We built a life together in that house on Mesquite Lane. We traveled when we could. We attended the same church. We argued about the thermostat and agreed about almost everything else. My children liked Howard, his 2 grown sons from a middle marriage. Yes, there had been a second marriage, which I knew about, visited for holidays and treated me with warmth. We were, to every outward appearance, a settled and contented couple. The first time I noticed something strange was in the autumn of 2004. I had gone to get something from Howard's desk in the study, a stapler, I think, or a pen, when I found a bank statement partially tucked under a file folder. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't the type. But the statement was open, face up, and a number caught my eye. A recurring transfer of $400 sent monthly to an account I didn't recognize. The memo line said simply LM. I remembered it, but I said nothing. Howard was a careful man with our finances, generous to a fault with his sons, and occasionally with charities he cared about. I told myself it was probably something I simply hadn't been told about. A nephew, a godchild, an old obligation. Married people don't owe each other itemized explanations for every dollar. I believed that then. I believe it less now. But the years passed, and the small strangeness of it faded. What didn't fade was the pattern. There were phone calls he took outside. Not frequently. Perhaps once a month, sometimes less. Howard would excuse himself from the living room, step onto the back porch, and speak quietly for 5 or 10 minutes. When he came back, he was always slightly more closed off than before, the way a door that's been opened a crack swings back to nearly shut. I noticed. I said nothing. There were moments when he seemed worried in a way he couldn't explain, a heaviness that came and went without obvious cause. I asked once, in 2011, whether everything was all right, whether there was something financial troubling him. He said he was fine. He looked at me steadily and said he was fine. And because I loved him, and because I had no evidence of anything, I believed him. It was in March of 2022 that I finally found something I could not reason away. I was organizing papers after our accountant suggested we update our estate planning documents. Howard was at a dental appointment. I was going through a filing cabinet, with full right to do so since our finances had always been nominally shared. And I found not one bank statement, but 11 of them, spanning the past 2 years, tucked inside a manila folder labeled Insurance Miscellaneous. The monthly transfers had grown. They were now $900 per month. Still to the same account. Still marked LM. I did the arithmetic slowly, sitting at the desk in the study, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds. If the transfers had averaged even $500 per month over 20 years, a conservative guess, that was $120,000. Gone to an account with 2 initials I didn't recognize. I put the statements back exactly as I had found them. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and then I picked up my phone and did something I had thought about doing, idly, more than once over the years, but never had. I searched for Patricia Howard's phone number. It took me 2 days to find her. She was still in Oregon, remarried with a different last name. But the town was right, and a mutual acquaintance, one of those tenuous social threads that survive decades without being pulled, gave me a number. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. I introduced myself. Patricia was civil, a little surprised, and after a moment, curious. We spoke for perhaps 15 minutes, working around the edges of why I might be calling. Then I asked, as carefully as I could, whether she knew if Howard had a daughter, a child from before their marriage perhaps, or from an affair. Patricia went quiet for a moment. Howard and I didn't have children, she said. We tried and it didn't happen. That was actually part of why things fell apart. Why do you ask? He's been sending money, I said, every month for as long as I can remember, to someone with the initials LM. Another silence. Dorothy, Patricia said, and her voice had shifted into something careful and kind, the way a voice shifts when it is about to deliver news it would rather not. Howard didn't have any children when I knew him, none that I ever heard of, but LM. I don't know who that is. I'm sorry. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a very long time. Who was LM? And where had $120,000 of our money gone? There is a particular kind of stillness that comes after a shock. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where the mind is running very fast behind a face that has gone very quiet. That was how I spent the next 4 days. I did not confront Howard. Not yet. I had learned something in my 72 years about the difference between having a question and having an answer, and I was not willing to ask the question until I was prepared for every possible answer. Howard was a careful man. If I came to him with suspicion and no evidence, he would find a way to explain things away, and I would be left with nothing but the damage of having accused him. So I went back to the files. I did it methodically, over 3 days, while Howard was at his golf club or running errands or watching the evening news in the living room 10 feet away from where I sat at the desk in the study with the door open, so he would hear nothing unusual in the silence. I went through every bank statement I could find, going back as far as our joint accounts extended. 12 years in the filing cabinet, another 3 years on the computer in scanned PDFs that Howard had organized but apparently not hidden. The transfers were there every month without exception. What varied was the amount. In the early years of our marriage, 2000, 2001, 2002, the transfers were small, 200, sometimes 250. By 2006, they had risen to 400. By 2012, 600. The most recent ones, the $900 monthly transfers I had found in the insurance misgears folder, had begun in 2019. The account number they were sent to was the same across all of it. The memo line changed occasionally, sometimes LM, sometimes simply blank. Once or twice the word loan in Howard's neat handwriting. I added it up on a legal pad, year by year. It took me an hour. The total across 22 years of marriage was $147,000, give or take. The number sat on the paper, and I stared at it for a long time. $147,000. Sent secretly in small enough increments that no single transfer would raise an alarm to an account I had never been told about. Not once in 22 years of marriage had Howard mentioned this. Not once had he said, "There is someone I help financially. Here is who they are. Here is why." Not once. Was I afraid? Yes. I was afraid of what the answer might be, because by that point, I had moved past the possibility of a godchild, or a charity, or an old loan. The amounts were too high, too consistent, too deliberately obscured. This was not generosity. This was something else. Something Howard had decided 20 years ago that I must never know. I thought about what it could be. A child, after all. But Patricia had said there was none. An affair, current or past, with someone who had leverage over him? A business partner from years ago? Some old debt that had never been resolved? The initials LM told me almost nothing. A woman's name, a man's. A company. I didn't know. What I knew was this. I was 72 years old. I had contributed to this household for 22 years, and $147,000 of our shared resources had been sent somewhere I was not permitted to know about. And if I did nothing, it would continue. The transfers were still happening. $900 every month to LM. I called my daughter, Susan, who lives in Phoenix and works as a paralegal. I did not tell her everything, not yet, but I told her I needed to ask her about financial privacy in a marriage and whether a spouse had the right to investigate a joint account. "Mom," she said after a pause, "what's going on?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Susan told me to call a family law attorney before I did anything else. She gave me the name of someone her firm occasionally worked with, a woman named Elaine Marsh, who had a quiet, no-nonsense reputation and an office in downtown Tucson. Susan said, "Document everything first, then make the call." So I documented. I photographed every statement with my phone. I wrote out the timeline on the legal pad in a handwriting small enough to fit on 4 pages. I added up the numbers twice to be sure. And then I went to the kitchen and made another cup of tea. And this time, I drank it. I had a plan. It was a small plan, and I was frightened of where it might lead. But I was more frightened of doing nothing, of sitting in this house for the rest of my life with a question I was never allowed to ask. I had given 22 years to this marriage. I had given it honestly. Whatever Howard had been doing with that money, I deserved to know. The next morning, I called Elaine Marsh's office and made an appointment. Elaine Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a glass and limestone building on Congress Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years without ever expecting to go inside. The waiting room was calm and unadorned. A few chairs, a side table with a water pitcher, a potted plant that looked as though it was genuinely thriving. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and reminded myself that I was not doing anything wrong. Elaine Marsh was perhaps 55, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct attention that makes a person feel they are being heard rather than assessed. I spread my 4 pages of notes and my photographs of the bank statements on her desk, and I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, made a few brief notes, and then leaned back in her chair. "This is marital property," she said. "In Arizona, assets accumulated during a marriage are community property. That means these transfers, every dollar of them, came from community property, and they were made without your knowledge or consent. That's significant." "What does significant mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you have standing to request a full accounting," she said. "And depending on what we find on the other end of that account, it may mean more than that." She looked at her notes. "LM. Do you have any idea who that might be?" I told her I didn't. I told her about my conversation with Patricia. Elaine wrote the initials down and circled them. "We can subpoena those bank records," she said, "if this goes to a formal proceeding. But before that, there are quieter ways to learn more. I'd suggest a private investigator, someone who can trace the account and the recipient without alerting your husband that you're looking." I had never hired a private investigator in my life. The phrase had always struck me as belonging to detective novels and television dramas. But I sat in that chair on the 4th floor of a building on Congress Street, and I said, "All right, who do you recommend?" His name was Daniel Reyes. He was methodical, soft-spoken, and had spent 17 years working financial fraud cases before going private. I met him the following week. He asked me a series of precise questions, took copies of my documentation, and told me he would need 2 to 3 weeks. It was during those 3 weeks that something shifted in the house. I am not sure how it happened. I had been careful, meticulous, I thought. I had not changed my behavior, had not moved any papers, had not spoken to anyone in Howard's circle. But Howard began to watch me differently, not with suspicion exactly. He was too controlled for that, but with a new attentiveness, the way a person pays closer attention to a door they've started to wonder about. He asked me one evening at dinner whether I had called anyone recently about financial matters. I said I had spoken to our accountant about updating our wills, which was true, and which was the cover I had used for my initial search through the filing cabinet. Howard nodded and said nothing more, and I watched his face very carefully. There was something there, a flicker. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon when I was returning home from the grocery store, I saw a car parked across the street from our house that I didn't recognize. A dark blue sedan with an out-of-state plate. It was gone when I came outside an hour later. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something. 3 weeks after I first met with Daniel Reyes, he called me and asked to meet at a coffee shop near his office. I drove there alone, without telling anyone where I was going. He had a folder with him. He set it on the table between us and opened it. The account the money had been sent to for 22 years belonged to a woman named Lorraine Mercer. She was 61 years old. She lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, 40 minutes from our house in Tucson. She had no formal employment on record for the past 15 years, no business registered in her name, no apparent source of income beyond what appeared to be private transfers from multiple sources. She had also, Daniel told me, a documented prior relationship with Howard that predated our marriage. She had been his secretary in the early 1990s when Howard ran his commercial real estate office. There were photographs in the folder, printed from old digital files Daniel had sourced from public records and social media, of Howard and Lorraine at what appeared to be a company event, standing close together, his hand at the small of her back. "This is not a daughter," I said. "No," Daniel said. "It's not." I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I closed the folder and put it in my handbag. I drove home. Howard was in the living room reading the newspaper. I said good evening. I made dinner. I sat across from him at the table we had shared for 22 years, and I did not show, on my face, a single thing that I was feeling. Because now I knew. The following Monday, I returned to Elaine Marsh's office with Daniel's folder. We spent 2 hours going through every piece of documentation. By the end of that meeting, Elaine had enough to file a formal complaint under Arizona community property law and request a full forensic accounting of our joint finances. She was clear with me about what would happen next. Howard would be served with notice. He would know. "Are you ready for that?" Elaine asked. "No," I said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The papers were served on a Thursday afternoon. I was not home when it happened. I had, on Elaine's advice, packed a small bag the night before and driven to Susan's apartment in Phoenix. I sat in Susan's living room and watched the afternoon light move across her floor and waited for my phone to ring. It rang at 4:17. Howard's voice was controlled. He was always controlled. But underneath the control, there was something I had never heard from him before. A kind of cold fury, tightly compressed. "Dorothy, what is this?" "It's a legal notice," I said. "Elaine Marsh will be in touch with your attorney." "You hired a lawyer without telling me." "You sent $147,000 to Lorraine Mercer without telling me," I said. "So I suppose we've both been doing things without telling each other." A silence, long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. "That money is a private matter," he said finally. "It has nothing to do with our marriage." "Howard," I said, "it is our money, not your money, our money, and that makes it very much to do with our marriage." He hung up. I thought that would be the end of the first conversation. It was not. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, and the number on the screen was not Howard's. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Dorothy, this is Lorraine Mercer. I think we need to talk." My hand tightened on the phone. "I don't think we do," I said. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice was smoother than I had expected. Practiced, I thought. The voice of someone who had done this before, talked her way through difficult conversations. Howard has obligations to me that predate your marriage. You don't understand the situation. I understand that $900 a month has been leaving my household for years, I said. I understand it went to you. That's the part that matters legally. If you pursue this, she said, and her voice dropped, there are things I know about Howard that would be very damaging. To him, to you, to your children. I recognized what she was doing. I had expected something like this, though I had not known its precise shape. I took a breath. If you have information you believe is legally relevant, I said, you're welcome to provide it to Elaine Marsh. She's very thorough. And then I hung up. That evening, I called Elaine and reported the conversation in full. She was unsurprised. Classic pressure tactic, she said. She's frightened. Let her be. She advised me to save all records of contact from either Howard or Lorraine and to respond to nothing further without Elaine's knowledge. Howard called twice more that week, once through his attorney and once personally, the latter in a quieter, more conciliatory tone that I recognized as strategy. He said he wanted to explain. He said it was complicated. He said I had never had reason to distrust him. I listened. I said I would have my attorney be in touch, and I ended the call. By the second week, the calls had stopped. Elaine told me that Howard's attorney had signaled a willingness to discuss settlement. It was early, far too early for me to consider it, but the silence was itself a kind of retreat. On the Saturday of that second week, Susan drove me to Sedona. We stayed in a small inn with a porch that looked out toward the Red Rocks, and we sat outside in the evenings with cups of tea and talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or bank statements or Lorraine Mercer. I ate well. I slept. I let the red landscape be large and quiet and indifferent in the way that landscape, at its best, can be. I needed 3 days. I took them. I came back from Sedona on a Tuesday morning, rested in a way I had not been in weeks. The house felt different to return to, quieter, and charged in some way I can't precisely describe, as though it were waiting. Howard had, per our arrangement through the attorneys, moved temporarily to a hotel near the university. His reading chair was empty. The newspaper he usually left folded on the side table was not there. The house was mine alone, for the first time in 22 years, and I found I was not unhappy in it. 2 days after I returned, a letter arrived. Not from Lorraine's attorney, from Lorraine herself, handwritten on expensive cream stationery. I set it on the kitchen counter and read it twice before I allowed myself to react. The letter was skillfully written, I will grant her that. It did not threaten. It appealed. It described, in careful, measured language, a relationship with Howard that had begun before I had ever appeared in his life. A relationship she characterized as the central fact of her existence, interrupted but never truly ended. She wrote about what she called Howard's sense of duty toward her. She suggested that I, as a woman of a certain age, could surely understand the complexity of long attachments, the ways in which love does not follow neat legal lines. Near the end, she offered me something. If I were to withdraw the legal action, she wrote, she would be willing to formalize the arrangement, to accept a fixed final sum from Howard and end the monthly transfers permanently. She framed this as a resolution that would spare everyone embarrassment. She used the word generous in describing her offer. She used the word dignity in describing what she was preserving. I read it a second time. I set it down. I took a walk around the block. Was there a part of me that felt the pull of it? I would be dishonest if I said no. What Lorraine was offering was the end of conflict, the quick resolution that would let me close the folder and return to the quieter life I had lived before I found those bank statements. I am old enough to know how seductive the absence of conflict can be, especially when you are tired and frightened and not entirely certain how much more disruption your heart can hold. But I also knew something that Lorraine's carefully worded letter did not account for. I was not tired anymore. I had slept in Sedona. I had come home. I had eaten breakfast that morning and stood at my kitchen window, watching the desert light move across the yard, and felt, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was not willing to let this go. $147,000. 22 years, and not a single word. I put the letter in an envelope, labeled it clearly, and drove it to Elaine's office. That same week, I did something I had been postponing. I called my friend Margaret Hoover, who had been my closest friend for 30 years, and who knew me better than almost anyone. I asked her to have lunch with me, and I told her everything. I told her about the bank statements. I told her about Daniel's folder and Lorraine Mercer's photographs. I told her about the phone call and the letter. I told her about the total, $147,000. I watched Margaret's face move through several expressions: shock, then something that looked like anger on my behalf, then a steadying. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need someone to know," I said. "And I need someone to tell me I'm not being unreasonable." "Dorothy Ann Callahan," Margaret said, "you are the most reasonable woman I know, and you are doing exactly the right thing. I am not someone who cries easily. I cried then, briefly, in a booth at a restaurant on Speedway Boulevard, and Margaret sat across from me and did not say anything unhelpful. I also called my son Robert, who lives in Denver. Robert is more measured than Susan, more given to weighing all sides. But when I laid out the facts, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Mom, we're with you. Whatever you need." Susan had already said as much. My children knew, my best friend knew, I was no longer carrying this alone. And Lorraine, she was watching, I felt sure of it, waiting to see if her letter had done its work, waiting for me to flinch. I did not flinch. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Howard called and asked if he could come to the house. Not through his attorney, personally. He said he wanted to talk, not as adversaries, but as two people who had shared 22 years. He said he missed the house. His voice, over the phone, sounded diminished in a way I had not heard before. Smaller than it had been that first angry call, thinner, older. I consulted Elaine. She advised caution, pointed out that anything said outside the legal process could be used in complicated ways, and reminded me that I was under no obligation. But she left the decision to me. I thought about it for 24 hours. Then I told Howard he could come, on a Saturday afternoon, for 1 hour. He arrived at 2 o'clock. He was dressed carefully, navy blazer, the gray slacks I had always liked on him. And he looked old to me in a way he had not before, which may have been his intention, or may simply have been true. He sat in the living room in his usual chair and folded his hands in the familiar way. And for a moment, I felt the full weight of 22 years, and it was almost unbearable. The house was very quiet around us. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and went silent. He began with an apology. Not a complete one. Howard had never done anything completely in his life. But the outline of an apology, the shape of regret. He said he should have told me about Lorraine years ago. He said it had begun before we met, that it was a complicated and unresolved attachment that he had not known how to end. He said the money was never about love. It was obligation, guilt, a debt he felt he owed her for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He chose his words the way a careful man lays down stepping stones. Precisely, one at a time, testing each for weight before committing to the next. "I never stopped loving you, Dorothy," he said. He said it quietly, and he looked at me directly when he said it. I recognized this too. It was not dishonest exactly. I believed he meant it, or had convinced himself he meant it. But it was a move, the apology, the diminishment, the declaration of love. These were instruments of a negotiation, and the negotiation was, let this go. I had spent 22 years in a house with a careful man, and I knew how careful men negotiate. They make you feel seen so that you will stop looking. Then Lorraine's name came up. He had spoken to her, he said, and he relayed what was, in essence, an elaborated version of her letter. A final settlement, a clean end, no court proceedings, no public record. He said it would be better for my children, who wouldn't want their mother's marriage examined in court documents. He said it would be better for me. He said the word dignity again, just as Lorraine had used it in her letter, and that repetition, that coordinated repetition, told me something important about how much the two of them had spoken, and how carefully they had prepared this visit. "Better for me," I repeated. "Cleaner," he said. "Quieter." I looked at him across the living room in the afternoon light that came through the shutters we had chosen together at a hardware store in 2003, and I thought, you have been doing this for 22 years. You have sat across from me, in this room, at this table, and let me believe something that was not true. And now you are asking me to choose, again, the version of my life that is more convenient for you. "Howard," I said, "my attorney will be in touch with yours." He was still for a moment, then something in his face shifted. The controlled exterior cracked just slightly, and beneath it I saw, briefly, something harder and less kind. "You're going to regret this," he said. It was quiet, but it was unmistakable. He let it sit between us for 3 or 4 seconds, long enough to make sure I had understood it. And then he stood, straightened his blazer, and walked to the door with the measured step of a man who has decided he has said enough. "I think you should go now," I said, though he was already going. He went. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull away from the curb, and my hands, when I noticed them, were trembling slightly against the counter. I was afraid. I won't pretend otherwise. Howard's parting words had been, underneath their measured delivery, a threat, and threats have weight regardless of how softly they're spoken. What did he mean by regret? A legal maneuver? A disclosure of something about me, real or invented? I did not know, and not knowing was its own particular variety of fear. But fear, I have learned, is not a stop sign. Sometimes it is an arrow. I called Elaine that evening and told her everything. I told her about the coordinated language, the word dignity appearing in both the letter and Howard's conversation. I told her about Howard's parting words. She wrote it down. She said, "Good. That goes in the file. All of it." And I felt, underneath the trembling, something I had not expected. A kind of iron patience, a willingness to keep going that had nothing to do with anger anymore, and everything to do with simply being unwilling to let go of what was mine. I had not come this far. Through the filing cabinet and Daniel's folder and the deposition preparations and Lorraine's letter and this long, careful Saturday afternoon. To stop now, because a man in a navy blazer had looked at me steadily and expected me to flinch. I did not flinch. I made dinner. I read for an hour in the blue-gray study that was not yet blue-gray, but would be. And I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept without difficulty, which surprised me, and which I took as a sign. The deposition was scheduled for a Monday morning in November. Elaine had prepared me thoroughly. What to expect, how to answer, what not to say unless asked directly. We had rehearsed the key moments twice in her office, with her playing the opposing attorney with a sharpness I found initially startling and then deeply reassuring. By the Friday before the deposition, I felt as ready as I was going to be. It was not the deposition itself that became the decisive moment. It was what happened that Friday morning. Elaine called me at 9 and asked me to come to her office immediately. Her voice was careful in a way that told me something had broken open. Not badly, but significantly, the way a lock sounds when the right key finally turns. I drove to Congress Street and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Daniel Reyes was already there, seated across from Elaine's desk with a second folder open in front of him, slightly thicker than the first. He had, at Elaine's request, conducted a deeper financial investigation into Lorraine Mercer's accounts over the past 3 weeks, tracing not just her receipts, but her expenditure patterns, cross-referencing account activity against publicly available records. What he had found went considerably further than either of us had anticipated. Lorraine Mercer had not been receiving money solely from Howard. The same account that had received Howard's transfers had also received funds from 2 other men, both of a similar age and professional background to Howard, both living in the Tucson and Scottsdale areas. Daniel had traced these through overlapping records, shared financial institutions, and a pattern of timing and amount that became unmistakable once the full picture was assembled. The amounts varied slightly from man to man. The regularity, monthly, consistent, sustained over years, was identical. Lorraine was not, by any legal definition, a blackmailer. There was no direct evidence of explicit written threats, nothing that would easily sustain a criminal charge on those terms. What there was, instead, was a pattern of sustained intimate deception. A woman who had maintained simultaneous long-term financial relationships with multiple men, in each case, leveraging old emotional history and personal vulnerability to sustain ongoing payments. In each case, ensuring the men's silence by keeping them convinced that their particular arrangement was unique, personal, and irreplaceable. She had been, in other words, running a kind of invisible enterprise built entirely on the loneliness and shame of careful men who believed they had a secret no one else shared. The other 2 men were named in Daniel's folder. One of them, when approached carefully and discreetly by Daniel, had confirmed the arrangement with a brevity that suggested relief as much as anything else. He had been sending money for 14 years. He thought he was the only one. Howard, it was now clear, had not been secretly supporting a woman he loved in any straightforward sense. He had been, for 22 years, paying to maintain a secret that Lorraine had originally cultivated and then quietly held in place with the patience and consistency of someone who understood exactly how much men will pay to keep their pasts private. Whether he had ever truly loved her, or had simply been afraid of her from very early on, I could not say with certainty. Perhaps both things were true at once. True at the deposition that Monday was no longer a standard community property proceeding. Elaine had coordinated over the weekend with the attorney of one of the other affected parties, the elderly man whose son had taken the situation very seriously and moved swiftly. Howard arrived with his attorney at 10 o'clock, dressed in a dark suit, looking as controlled as I had ever seen him, his face arranged in the expression of a man who believes he still has the situation in hand. Lorraine arrived separately, 20 minutes late, in a charcoal blazer and pearls, with an attorney I didn't recognize. Younger than I expected, with the slightly tense posture of someone who has been given a difficult brief on short notice. Elaine laid out the full documentation on the conference table without preamble or theatrics. The 22 years of transfers, the forensic account records, Daniel's complete report on the parallel arrangements with the other two men, the written confirmation from the second party, and a financial timeline that showed, month by month, the architecture of what Lorraine had built. She presented it in the flat and careful voice of someone who has learned, through long practice, that facts do not need embellishment. They need only to be laid clearly in the light. I watched Lorraine's face as the second folder was opened and Elaine began to read the account numbers aloud. For 22 years, Lorraine had been entirely safe, managing these men in separate silence, relying on their shame and their particular species of attachment, the kind that makes a person pay indefinitely rather than confess, to keep each of them contained. The one variable she had not accounted for was one of the women deciding that her own name and her own share of the money were worth more than the cost of the fight. Lorraine's composure cracked in increments, and it was almost architectural to watch. First, the fixed stillness in her face loosened slightly around the jaw, then a tightening appeared around her eyes. Then came a whispered exchange with her attorney that lasted 4 minutes and concluded with her attorney touching her arm in the way attorneys touch their clients when the news is not good and there is no softer way to deliver it. Her attorney asked for a recess. Elaine declined, citing the scheduled timeline and the presence of the second party's representative. Lorraine looked at the table. Howard, for his part, had gone the color of old concrete, not ill, not collapsing, simply deflated, structurally, as though something interior had quietly given way. He was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, run entirely out of room to maneuver. His attorney leaned toward him and said something low. Howard shook his head once, slightly, and did not look up. At the end of the formal session, Lorraine's attorney requested a private conference. We gave them 1 hour in a smaller room down the hall. Elaine and I sat in the conference room and drank water from the pitcher on the table and did not say much. There was nothing much to say. The folder was on the table. The numbers were on the record. Everything that had been hidden for 22 years was now, in the careful language of legal documentation, fully visible. When the hour was up, they came back with a settlement offer. It was not, Elaine told me quietly, the offer of people who believe they have any leverage left. It was the offer of people who want the room to stop looking at them. I sat at that table with my hands folded in my lap and my face composed, and I felt, underneath the composure, something that I can only describe as the opposite of fear. A stillness that was not resignation, but clarity. The clarity of a person who has finally located the true floor of a situation and found it solid under her feet. 22 years. $147,000. And now, at last, the full picture on the table in front of everyone. I listened to the offer in full. I let the silence sit for a moment after Lorraine's attorney finished speaking. Then I looked at Elaine, who gave the smallest of nods. "We'll need that in writing," I said, "by end of business Friday." The settlement was signed 11 days later in Elaine's office, on a Tuesday morning when the sky outside the fourth-floor windows was the particular pale blue of a Tucson November, cloudless, high, indifferent to human arrangements in the most comforting way. Under the agreement, Howard was required to repay to me from his personal assets the full amount determined by the forensic accountant, which came to $163,000 once the accountant had included compound interest on funds withdrawn from a joint investment account over the same period. The original $147,000 I had calculated at the kitchen table with my legal pad and my careful arithmetic had been conservative. The full picture was worse. The repayment was structured to be completed within 18 months, secured against Howard's share in a commercial property he had retained from his real estate years, a strip of land outside of Marana that he had held onto through both his previous marriages and regarded, I had always sensed, as something privately inviolable. It was no longer inviolable. The settlement also included a full accounting clause. Howard was required to disclose all financial accounts held in his name, individually or jointly, for the entire duration of our marriage. The forensic accountant's review of those accounts found no additional hidden transfers beyond the Lorraine payments, which told me something I had quietly needed to know. The deception had been singular. Extensive and sustained, yes, but not the symptom of a wider hidden life, not the surface of something deeper and more comprehensive. That knowledge did not erase anything, but it clarified the shape of what I was dealing with, and clarity has its own value. The divorce itself was finalized 4 months after the deposition, on a cold, bright morning in February. I drove to the courthouse with Susan, who sat beside me in the waiting area with her hand in mine and did not offer unnecessary words, which is one of the things I have always loved about my daughter. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement, asked me 2 questions in a mild and unhurried voice, and signed the decree. The whole proceeding took 11 minutes. 22 years. 11 minutes. There is something both absurd and clarifying about that ratio, and I have thought about it many times since. I did not cry. I had expected to. Instead, I felt a kind of weightlessness. Not happiness, not quite relief, but the particular sensation of a door closing that has been open too long on a draft. The absence of cold is its own form of warmth. Outside the courthouse, in the February sun that hit the pale limestone of the building at a low winter angle and turned everything briefly golden, Susan squeezed my hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think I am," I said, and I meant it with a completeness I had not felt in a long time. I want to be precise about what I won and what I lost, because I think precision matters here more than comfort. I won the full financial accounting. I won the repayment. I won the truth, which had cost me 22 years of living inside a partial fiction, a fiction that had been, in its better moments, genuinely pleasant, but which I now had, at last and completely and irrevocably, in my possession. I lost a marriage that had been real in its way, not entirely false. The travel was real, and the companionable evenings, and the accumulated texture of a shared life that does not simply dissolve because its foundation was compromised. That loss was genuine, and I did not minimize it, not to myself, and not to anyone who asked. But I had not lost my house. I had not lost my children. I had not lost Margaret, or my church, or the desert light through the kitchen window, or the particular pleasure of a morning that belongs entirely to you. And I had not. And this, in the weeks after the decree, came to feel like the most important thing. Lost the sense of myself as a woman who had looked at a hard truth and chosen it over a comfortable lie. In the weeks after the decree, I did 2 things. The first was practical. I met with Claire, my financial planner, and we went through the repayment schedule, the retirement accounts, the investment strategy for the recovered funds. The picture was not bleak. I had been careful with money all my life, and what had been taken was real, but recoverable, and Claire went through it all with the thoroughness and lack of condescension that I had come to expect from her. By the end of that first meeting, I understood my financial position with a clarity I had not had for 22 years, and that clarity itself felt like a form of recovered wealth. The second thing was smaller and private. I drove, one afternoon in late February, out past the city limits to a stretch of desert road I had always loved. A long, straight road that runs between low hills covered in saguaro and palo verde, where the sky feels particularly large and the silence is the kind that has texture to it. I pulled over and got out and stood in the cold, dry air. The saguaros cast long blue shadows in the afternoon sun. A hawk circled something distant and patient. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, not thinking about Howard or Lorraine or the conference table or the 11 minutes in the courtroom, just being in the landscape, which was large and honest and asked absolutely nothing of me. Then I got back in the car, turned the heat on low, and drove home along the road I had always loved, through the late afternoon light that turned the desert gold and then amber, and then a deep, quiet red before the sun went down completely. The house on Mesquite Lane was lit from inside when I pulled into the driveway. I had left the kitchen light on. It looked, from the outside, like a house where someone lived well. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at it. Then I went inside. Spring came to Tucson with its particular intensity. The jacaranda trees on my block bloomed purple 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the mornings were warm enough to take coffee out to the back porch by March. I noticed the season in a way I had not in years, the way you notice things when the ongoing low hum of dread has finally gone quiet. I repainted the study. I had always found the color, a deep tan that Howard had chosen in 2005. Oppressive in some way I'd never been able to name. I chose a pale blue-gray, the color of the sky at 7 in the morning when the light is still soft, and I painted it myself over a long weekend with Susan and her daughter helping. It took us 12 hours and we laughed more than I had expected. The room, afterward, was entirely mine. I resumed things I had allowed to go quiet over the years of the marriage. I had been a committed reader before Howard, working my way through the kind of long novels that require weeks of sustained attention, and I had, somewhere in our domestic life, gradually ceded the evenings to his television preferences. Now I read every night, in the blue-gray study, in a chair I had bought for myself at an estate sale in April. I joined a morning walking group through my church. 6 women between 68 and 81 who met at 6:30 at a park 3 blocks from my house and walked for 45 minutes while talking about everything and nothing. I looked forward to those mornings with an unashamed eagerness. Margaret and I had lunch every Thursday. Robert came to visit for a week in May, and we drove up to the White Mountains and hiked a trail that I had last walked in my 40s, and I was slower than I used to be and unbothered by it. Susan and I talked on the phone 3 times a week, and the conversations no longer had that particular undertone of maternal worry that had colored them through the worst months of the proceedings. The repayment from Howard arrived in its first installment in April, deposited directly to an account I had opened in my name alone. I did not spend it immediately. I left it there for 2 months, getting used to the weight of it, before Claire and I discussed where it should go. We decided in the end on a combination of conservative investments and a modest renovation to the back portion of the house that I had been putting off for a decade. The renovation was finished by summer. The contractor said I had good taste. I told him I had always had good taste. As for Howard, I heard through Susan, who had a connection to his elder son, that he had left the hotel after the divorce and moved into a small condo near the university. A compact 2-bedroom in a complex that was, by all accounts, perfectly adequate and entirely cheerless. His sons had taken the news of the proceedings with a kind of pained resignation, neither defending him vigorously nor completely abandoning him. He was, as far as I understood, aging in that condo with reduced finances and reduced standing and managing, as stubborn people do, to seem fine on the surface. but the commercial property that had been secured against his repayment was eventually sold at a loss to meet a second installment. And I was told, quite recently, that his financial position was considerably diminished. Lorraine Mercer did not fare better. The civil complaint filed by the second man's son went to mediation and then to a judgment. I do not know the exact figure, but I was told it was substantial. Substantial enough that she had, within the year, sold her Scottsdale condo and moved somewhere less expensive. The third man in Daniel's report, who had not initially come forward, retained an attorney of his own after the judgment was publicized in a brief notice in the Arizona Republic. There were, I imagined, further proceedings. I did not follow them closely. I had no appetite for it. What I had an appetite for was my life. My actual life. The morning walks and the long novels and the blue-gray study and the Thursday lunches and the desert outside my kitchen window. I was 73 years old, and I had, after a significant detour, arrived back at myself. There is something I want to say about anger, because people sometimes ask me whether I am still angry. The answer is no. Not because I have forgiven everything, or because I think what was done was acceptable, but because anger, sustained past its useful moment, is a form of residence. It means you are still living in the house of the wrong that was done to you. I chose, at some point in the spring, to move out. I chose my own house instead. What would you have done? If this story moved you or stayed with you, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment. Tell a friend. These things happen in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, and sometimes knowing they happen and knowing what one person did about it is exactly what someone else needs to hear. Thank you for listening.